So, hi everyone. Welcome to the first in a series of Global Mangrove Alliance webinars organised by the Finance Working Group and exploring different financing mechanisms for mangrove conservation and restoration work. The Finance Working Group is the GMA's newest and smallest group, and we have really just formed with the aim of curating this series of webinars throughout 2025 to address some of the finance questions that have been raised by our members and chapters over the last few months. And we'll continue to organise webinars in response to the feedback that you share with us. So please do let us know what you're interested in and what you would like to hear about over the coming months, and we'll do our best to do that for you. With that in mind, today we're exploring the emerging market for biodiversity credits, how they're used, the safeguards and quality measures that buyers are looking for, and what that looks like, beginning with the global big picture and then moving to a more project development perspective. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce our presenters today. Erika Korosi is Senior Director for Nature Markets and Nature Finance at Conservation International. Alessandro Valentini specialises in innovative finance for nature at the World Economic Forum. Evie Ward is the Blue Carbon Coordinator at Plan Vivo. And your hosts today are Henna Pickard with the Global Mangrove Alliance. And I'm Mark Beeston, Technical Director for the Blue Carbon Programme at Conservation International. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And although there's a few people joining, we do have a packed schedule, so we will get started. So first of all, over to Erika.
Thank you, Mark. And it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to see so much interest in the biodiversity credit market opportunity. So I'm just going to provide a very high-level overview before I hand over to my colleagues, Alessandro and Evie, and then very happy, obviously, to take any questions and answers after that. Thanks, Mark. Go to the next slide. So I think we're all fairly familiar with this challenge. We're facing interconnected crises of biodiversity loss, climate change, and human development inequities. And compounding these crises is the fact that we need to act with urgency. We know conserving and restoring nature are two key ways to address decline, support climate mitigation and resilience, and support sustainable human development. But the big issue is we just don't have enough finance to sustain nature and all who depend on it. And you've probably all heard of the finance gap for biodiversity and climate, which is substantial. And so many, I guess, opportunities are being explored, of which these biodiversity credit, or I call them nature credit markets, are one. And I will say the way these markets should be thought of is it's not necessarily a standalone market. It's really about a complementary financing tool. So it could be something that complements carbon markets, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. It could be something that supports other finance mechanisms like bonds, for example. But ultimately, what these markets are trying to do is they are trying to drive new and additional ways to finance nature, reward those stewarding nature, in particularly Indigenous peoples and local communities, and support the shift to nature positive economies. And I guess do so in a way where, as we've seen with carbon from a business perspective, by putting a value on the benefits nature provides, helps incentivize better behaviours toward reducing impact and supporting nature. Thanks. So what do we mean when we talk about biodiversity credits? Well, as I said, these are about looking at opportunities for new and additional ways to finance nature and create this shift. And to call on a core definition that's out there issued by the Biodiversity Credit Alliance in a document they've published called the Definition of a Biodiversity Credit. A biodiversity credit is a certificate that represents a measured and evidence-based unit of positive biodiversity outcome that is durable and additional to what would have otherwise occurred. So I've highlighted some of these key terms. Firstly, measured and evidence-based. I think that's fairly self-explanatory in the sense that it needs to be quantified. Positive biodiversity outcome. The term outcome is one I've highlighted because it's not necessarily just about the biodiversity outcome. It's also about the socioeconomic outcomes and the management outcomes. Durable is a word that we've specifically chosen in biodiversity credits to shift away from permanence that you would probably be familiar with as blue carbon professionals because of, I guess, the fact that the concept of permanence is likely to change over time. And what we ultimately want to ensure is that these outcomes that we're seeking are able to support resilience and enable adaptation. So it's more about durable and that concept of durability. And I've also highlighted additional because that is a term that is shifting a little bit in some circumstances away from the way it's thought about in carbon markets. And in particular, it's because I'll talk about these two broad use cases and the way they're being thought of. And I know Evie may likely touch on this as well as it relates to how Plan Vivo define these terms. But the two broad use cases we think about in biodiversity credit markets, which is a little bit different to carbon, is we're thinking about how do we credit for what we call a conservation or stewardship scenario, which is essentially maintaining an intact state or slowing biodiversity decline. So if you think about sort of the target state or the baseline state, in a maintenance, conservation or stewardship scenario, what we're trying to enable is crediting that recognises either maintaining that conservation, that state of biodiversity within a band, or at least maintaining it in a less reduced form. So that's really important because that's not something that current carbon markets enable. The second scenario, which is sort of more aligned to the way carbon markets work, is the uplift scenario. And really that's about credit generation on the basis of an improvement compared to business as usual. So that could be, for example, through restoration activities. It could also be through avoided loss activities. And because of those two different scenarios, we think of the concept of additionality as taking different forms. So in particular, for the stewardship scenario, the concept of additionality is starting to think more about what I term broadly as management additionality. So that could be financial additionality in the sense that what you're able to demonstrate is there are insufficient finances to effectively manage the area. And as a result of the revenue streams coming from biodiversity credits, it enables additional finance to support sustainable financing activities. It could be additionality from the perspective of creating a new conservation area. It could be additionality in regards to recognition of Indigenous peoples and local community rights. So it's an emerging area that's still subject to discussion, but I really did want to highlight the difference, particularly when you think about additionality with a carbon lens. Thanks, Mark. So where are these markets at? I guess it is still a nascent market, but we are seeing significant growing momentum across the market ecosystem. And if you're not already connected into some of, I guess, the communications that come out in regards to the status of the market, Bloom Labs is a really helpful one that comes out with occasional analyses. And this is a map they did late last year around the status of these markets across the ecosystem of supply integrity, demand and enablers such as MRV, which shows I guess just illustratively, there are a lot of intersects and a lot of interests that are emerging, whether it's developers, credit schemes, demand facilitators, practice setters, or MRV providers. At the moment, there are over 50 crediting standards, so there hasn't necessarily been a consolidation yet in regards to how crediting occurs or measurement methods. We are seeing, however, I guess, some consistency in regards to, I guess, the metrics that underpin some of these methodologies, and Evie is likely to talk to Plan Vivo. And we're also starting to see coalitions forming. For example, the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, which is an initiative that is led by the UK and French governments. And the Biodiversity Credits Alliance, which is a program under the United Nations Development Program, which is growing and currently has membership of over 200 different organisations seeking to facilitate and enable some of the key criteria that underpin biodiversity credits. Thanks. Now, I've got a couple of slides on demand. I know Alessandro is going to be talking to this in more detail, but just to very quickly highlight an analysis that did come out from the World Economic Forum, which did show there is significant potential for material nature credit or biodiversity credit markets. And really, I mean, looking at the mid-case scenario here, sort of in the order of 70 billion per year potential, and that's not including the potential that might be associated with offset markets, which is a different biodiversity offset markets, a different conversation, but potentially linked in some regulatory regimes. Thanks, Mark. Again, I know Alessandro is touching on use cases as well, but I do want to highlight sort of if you think across the sphere of a company's influence, there are a range of use cases, and within the crediting space, we talk about them ranging from compensation to contribution. And as I said before, the notion of offsets from a biodiversity credit perspective is still quite a contentious issue. But generally, the way we're thinking about at least the emergence of voluntary biodiversity credit markets is they're not considered appropriate for offsets. But what we are seeing is in some regulatory regimes, such as in Colombia, offsetting is providing the basis for entry into voluntary markets. So you have opportunities that are designed to meet regulatory offset requirements, which are quite specific. And then you have the opportunity to sell, I guess, residual offsets into the voluntary market, but that is a very distinct use case. Predominantly, we think about the voluntary biodiversity credit market in this contribution space, where it could be to support contributions within an organisation's value chain as a result of where its supply comes from. And then as we move out sort of from direct operations, it could contribute to products and use or even beyond value chain opportunities. And sort of going along that scale, what it means is that we go from sort of what would be a more traditional offset approach that requires ecological and location equivalence and a strong level of quantification as we start thinking about contribution use cases to credits that enable greater flexibility from a purchase perspective. So the typology and geography can be quite flexible. But I know, again, Alessandro is touching on this a little bit more. Thanks. As it relates, I guess, to the interest of this audience, one thing we do see is that carbon will likely provide a strong opportunity to catalyse nature credit markets. In particular, the most early transactions will likely leverage carbon, in particular through what we call the stacked opportunities, which is what you see in the centre of this slide here. So a stacked opportunity basically means that you're generating two assets within the same project area. So if we take mangroves as an example of interest, it might be that you have the opportunity to generate a blue carbon project, but that blue carbon project alone might not provide sufficient revenue to really enable the scale of the project that is most desirable. So that could create the opportunity to generate a nature or biodiversity credit as part of that same project. And I know Evie is likely to touch on this, but there are some strict criteria, Plan Vivo and certainly Vera are requiring if you are investigating stacking opportunities to ensure that there is appropriate additionality and there isn't double counting. But that is certainly a strong opportunity we see. There is the bundled opportunity, which is what's already out there for many, I guess, particularly blue carbon projects, which is counting the biodiversity co-benefits as part of a carbon opportunity, but that really is not necessarily creating, I guess, the sort of distinct biodiversity credit market we're thinking about. And then ultimately, there is the standalone opportunity as well. So that might be an example where, for example, in marine environments where the carbon opportunity isn't significant, but it does open up the opportunity to a nature or biodiversity credit specifically. Thank you. And then finally, the other item of significance we're seeing in terms of the development of these markets is the creation of some initial guardrails to support the establishment of high integrity markets. And really, there's two key documents I'll point out. And again, I know Alessandro's will certainly refer to the work of one of them. So in October, we had the release of the framework for high integrity biodiversity credit markets by the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits. And this is really a high level discussion document, but the framework is what you can just see on this slide here, and really sort of talks to three broad areas of activity, or I guess principles that underpin these markets. So verified outcomes for nature, equity and fairness for people, and good governance for markets. And I won't go into the detail, but you can see sort of the various categories that are part of these, the framework. Supporting the framework is the emergent high-level principles to guide the biodiversity credit market, and that's currently a draft working document that's been issued by the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, which is supporting this framework that the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits issued. And so what that document is doing is going into this framework that you can see here in more detail to really articulate sort of essentially the minimum expectations of this framework across the life cycle, criteria, validation, rights, inclusion and rewards, transparency and accountability aspects. And I guess to draw a parallel from the carbon market, it's really similarly trying to set the scene for an assurance mechanism that ultimately would signal what criteria high integrity requires. So all of that is in emergence, but I guess one of the things it's quickly seeking to influence is standard setters. It's also seeking to influence activities of a number of the pilot projects that are underway, and also seeking to influence the establishment of shifts towards regulation, which we see, again, drawing on learning from the carbon market. Regulation is really critical to establish, in particular, firmer guardrails for high integrity markets. So that really is it for my introduction, and I'm very happy later to take some questions. Thank you, Mark. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Erika. Any questions from our participants, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll address them, either respond in the chat or we'll talk about them at the end of the session. Thank you very much, and we'll hand over to Alessandro.
Thanks, Mark, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Alessandro Valentini. I'm Innovative Finance for Nature lead at the World Economic Forum. We can jump straight into the next slide. Just a quick introduction to the World Economic Forum for those of you who are not familiar with the organization. We like to consider ourselves the global organization for public-private cooperation. So we engage both public sector and private sector to create that platform for them to come together and somehow see what's next in the global agendas across a number of topics. And I see it, of course, into the Center for Nature and Climate when we look at net zero, nature positive, and what we call better living, but it's everything that connects to also resource circularity and food, water, and all that. In the next slide, I want to do a quick step back, and I won't take too much time on this, but our work on biodiversity credit as the World Economic Forum has mostly been focused on the demand side. How do we bring the corporates into the table? How do we bring the investors into the table? We are better placed to do that. We are not ecologists, we're not biologists. We don't have a big presence on the ground in the different ecosystems. So we've been focusing on that side, on the economic side of the market, and how do we actually create something that it's fit for purpose for these businesses, for these investors that needs to put their money into to bridge the financing gap. And so it's important when we put this lens on, it's important to say, why would investors start to look at this? Of course, we know that the first answer that we always give is that the economy is fully dependent on nature, and more than half of it is moderately or highly dependent on it. And so that gives us an understanding that without acting on these polycrises that are mostly related to the environmental issues, there won't be an economy in 50, 100, 200 years that can flourish and can be sustainable. And so that is the first message. And in the second one, this is reinforced. If we go basically to the next slide, this is reinforced by the every year survey on the global risks that the forum conducts. And we can see that basically the long-term risks are all, the most important one, are environmentally related. And the fun part there, when we could set up a discussion for another webinar, but there is a short-termist problem here, because every year the long-term risks are environmentally, and every year there is a new short-term risk. So this gives us an understanding of how in the short term we never perceive all these biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse as a clear risk, but in the long term it is. And this has been this way for years, meaning that we're still not really acting on those long term, but there is always a shorter term risk that comes. In the next slide, jumping into the market, basically, why do we need this market? We now know it, there is some risk, there are clear dependencies. So what are now these markets that are forming around nature and biodiversity? Just to make a little bit, and I think Erika already covered some of this, so I'll be quick. But just to make a distinction between the voluntary and compliance market that are emerging. The voluntary can be both regulated or non-regulated. Some examples are, for example, the Australian Nature Repair Market or the India Green Credit programs that are where the governments are basically setting up the rules for the markets, but they are not mandating companies or other actors to be part of those markets. And then, of course, there is the non-regulated, pure voluntary market that we've observed also in the carbon space. And then there are more the compliance schemes that are more what Erika also was referring to toward the offsets, like the UK biodiversity net gain policy, which is the first of its kind in terms of real estate and development, or the Colombian market that's been there as well for a while. So in the next slide, what are some of those questions that we observe? And mind you that this has been a slide that I've been presenting for the next year, but I do think that there are some promising updates that will happen in the next months. So why the buyers, what are the questions that are out there for the buyers, and why we haven't seen a lot of demand? First of all, and there is not established taxonomy with different terms that we're using in terms of nature, biodiversity, credit, certificate, tokens, and all of that. This creates a little bit of confusion and a barrier to entry for some of the business that are still on a wait and see moment to understand what are we talking about. There is, of course, that plethora of methodologies that is also emerging. All of them have different metrics, different measurement systems. And there is, and maybe Evie will speak to that, and this is why I say that the next months will be quite exciting, because there has not been a recognized standard yet that is being publicly traded. And then we can understand why business are still not buying this product. All of this has generated like a lack of solid business case that has not driven up demand. And we've seen that in a lot of developments from the ground, but not really a lot of buying and deals happening on the demand side. And the other two that I also always have in my radar are, as Erika was saying, there is for now a little bit of stacking, a little bit of bundling. There is independent credits, but really this relation between the different nature markets, and I want to include into this not only the carbon, but also the water market, for example, is not very clear for the buyers. And hence, there are different things that are happening around nature markets, but when it comes to biodiversity credits, it's not clear how they interact with each other. And there is also a lack of governance from the pure voluntary side, of course, that can guarantee that integrity is out there. Some of the key developments, if we move to the next slide, were, of course, last year, thanks to COP16 and on the work done by organizations like Biodiversity Credit Alliance, APB. Erika mentioned this. Before introducing the APB framework, I want to mention this principle, because these principles were a shared piece of work with among different organizations, and I think that was a great effort from all of us coming together and kind of like saying and sending a strong message that we know what are those boundaries that we want to see, those guardrails that we want to see, and then at least at a higher level, before even talking about what is a biodiversity project specifically, what is the methodology, right? We want to see some guardrails. And this is the work that we did with APB and the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, coming up with these 21 principles that have formed the base basically from the APB framework, and will form the base for most of the work that will happen around biodiversity credit. Erika already mentioned them, so I'm not going to go too much into the details, but I really encourage you to familiarize yourself with this principle, because I'm pretty sure they will be forming somehow an high-level view of what we want to see in terms of both having nature at the core, but also the people and the indigenous communities that are the stewards in most of the situation for nature. And how do we not only do and use free, prior, and informed consent or benefit sharing, but also try to involve them as much as possible into the design and implementation of these projects. So if we move to the next slide, I mentioned that this principle basically formed the base for the APB framework that, as Erika mentioned, is a very high-level framework. These are the key findings. Again, you can go and read a lot more. There is also all the separate papers on demand. As the World Economic Forum, we were co-leading the work on the demand of the APB, but there is also the governance, there's also the metrics and measurement, the supply. So they've done a lot of work on that front. But the key message basically that they incorporated into the frameworks are, it is feasible, and this is also a message to overall to both buyers, but also the all market actors, that it is possible for this biodiversity credit to develop at scale and pace. High integrity, again, they, as mentioned, they include those principles into the framework, and meaning that for them, high integrity means a verified outcome for nature, equity, fairness for people, and good governance. They recognize once again the role of the stewards. They clarify also again what are they talking about when they talk about biodiversity credits using the BCA definition that Erika mentioned. They define 3 use cases, which is contribution to nature goal, local compensation for biodiversity impacts, and insetting. And at the same time, the IAPB has positioned strongly itself against global offsetting approaches. So this should be something to be careful about whenever we also talk about stapling with carbon credits, etc. That global offsetting, it's still not seen as acceptable also by actors like IAPB. At this stage, there will be multiple markets that develop, and they recognize that probably the most successful use cases or the most successful markets that will be around and will utilize a project finance approach. So we're not necessarily talking here about a commodity, but we are starting to include biodiversity credit consideration into the projects, which is where it becomes interesting also into the broader context, into the broader discussion of seeing, for example, nature and biodiversity as an asset when we develop some of these projects. Moving on, the design solutions therefore need to support the different contexts. Of course, biodiversity is very local specific, and they need to recognize all the different contexts. And sorry, the last point was that the ambition and it has to be there needs to be a collective leadership around this market. There needs to be that public-private cooperation across all the market actors, across all the different geographies for this market to then be set up and become efficient and effective at scale. This is basically what already Erika mentioned on what are the opportunities of the demand in the medium to long term. And we mentioned that there are a few things that need to happen. Those few, including in those few things, and probably most important, is also the role of governments, the role of governance, the role of basically regulation. How do we create some sort of enabling environment for this market to be developed at scale, to create that integrity, but also to create that trust for buyers to move forward with some of this testing and piloting. So we've done a lot of work on the demand side, as you can see, around the use cases, around the drivers, around what does it mean. And I'll dive deep on that in a second. If we go to the next slide, for example, one of the things that we've done is talking to buyers and trying to understand what is driving them to buy credits. Some of them are saying, we might buy credit because we are mission driven or for access to ecosystem services, and those are more internal reasons, like insecting and within the value chain. And we might also be driven by regulatory, so from all the external factors, or differentiating our product and ourselves from different actors, having a reputational position in terms of nature, but also access to finance, which is also an interesting driver, because if we start to see, again, that nature as project finance, and we lower through biodiversity credits the risks that are environmentally related, then the access to finance improves. And that is an interesting use case and an interesting drivers. In the second slide here, basically we've done some work, if we can go ahead, on what does it mean? What is the journey for corporates to buy biodiversity credits? Of course, the first step that we mention as one of the most important, and probably the one that without which will make all the efforts vain, is having a nature strategy. A nature strategy is fundamental in all corporates and investors positioning, because it creates that North Star, those ambition, those targets that then can be reached with, for example, biodiversity credits or other instruments. But without a clear nature strategy, without having a clear plan on how corporates want to be seen and want to involve themselves with nature work, with climate work, that all piece is lacking fundamental and foundations. We've mentioned the active frameworks, which is one of the most used for nature strategy for now. The thing that we developed further to the active framework, which is more also used for reporting purposes, is how do you actually then finance the nature strategy? And that is a big question for the corporates and the corporation, and where we will put a lot of effort in the next year of work. How do we actually move from, okay, we have a strategy now, we want to see what are the right instruments, we want to see where to act, we want to see what are the metrics we want to use. So we develop this roadmap for them to start piloting and start moving from, we know what to do, how do we do it? And again, the strategy uses the credits as an example, but some of the steps will be also applicable to other instruments, because again, as Erika mentioned, this is not necessarily the silver bullet or the whole market, but there will be a lot of different instruments that will evolve. And finally, I want to go into the claims piece very briefly. I know my time is running out, because the last step of this roadmap is basically communicating why, what is your use case, why you're buying the credits, and have that clear communication plan also to avoid greenwashing and all of that. This is some of the work that we've done as the forum, and we identified a few use cases, including enhancing carbon credit strategies, of course, insetting, so accessing those ecosystem services through the work within value chain, or generally contributing to nature recovery beyond their own impact. That could be, for example, trying to be aligned with a GBF or support a GBF work, offer product bundle with nature. We've seen this already happening with carbon, for example. Done with integrity could be a good use case also for biodiversity. And the one that we still saw at the voluntary level as contentious was the taking responsibility for the unmitigated biodiversity impacts. But there is a lot of advancement in the discussion in terms of how do we do that, like for like, not global offsets, but locally relevant to the projects and third-party audited and all of that. In the final slide, it's the use case the IAPP identified, very similar, and Erika already mentioned, so I'll be very brief. But they mentioned the evidence-based contribution, so voluntary contribution that is voluntary. And then from the compensation side, the voluntary, as I was mentioning, is a little bit more contentious at the moment, but the compliance one is definitely what will drive mostly bid market. So the regulation will be possibly the biggest driver for some of this market. And the last one that they also mentioned is, again, the connection with the carbon credits and other type of nature markets. I'll stop here. Again, very happy to reply to questions and take some comments, but I'll pass it back to you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Alessandro and Erika. One thing which really stands out here is that with carbon markets, the CDM and VCM launched, and then frameworks for quality and safeguarding came afterwards. So it's actually really encouraging seeing this detailed work being carried out now at market inception, rather than 5 years later, 10 years later down the line. For our final presentation, we shift from the more global view to the more project development perspective and hand over to Evie from Plan Vivo. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks Mark. Just wait until the slides are on the screen. Great, thank you. Hi, I'm Evie. I'm Blue Carbon Coordinator at Plan Vivo Foundation. I also work across the biodiversity team on aspects like PV Nature, which I'm here to talk to you about today. So next slide, please, Mark. So a little introduction to Plan Vivo for those who don't know who we are. Plan Vivo is a charitable foundation, so headquartered in Edinburgh in Scotland. and has 25 years experience working with smallholders and climate resilient or climate sensitive communities across the world to access nature markets. The foundation, we currently oversee 2 different standards. So the Plan Vivo carbon standard, which is where we originated from, PV Climate, which has been operating for the full 25 years. And then the new and developing and recently launched Plan Vivo Biodiversity Standard, PV Nature. We operate across both standards with a unique model that very much puts either smallholder farmers or community groups at the center of the project design and implementation and operation. So I'm going to focus a little bit today on some of the aspects of the standard that really kind of hone in on the equitable project design. So next slide, please, Mark. So what is PV Nature? So as I mentioned, recently launched in 2023, PV Nature is a standard, but it's also a certification that gives access to nature finance through the issuance of biodiversity certificates. And through this mechanism, Indigenous peoples, local communities and smallholders and other local organisations or community-based organisations or NGOs are able to benefit from nature markets and to help mobilise the much needed funding to incentivise biodiversity conservation and restoration at a local scale. As I'm sure we all know on this call, and as Erika touched on as well, there's a huge funding gap for nature conservation, estimated at about $800 billion per year. I'm sure that's actually growing at the moment as well. And it's particularly the case in the oceans. I think I remember reading a stat about SDG 14 being the least funded of all the SDGs. So having new mechanisms like PV Nature to be able to drive forward, I guess, finance and responsible finance to projects that would otherwise not be funded under the carbon markets is really exciting. We also have a strong focus on integrating biodiversity conservation with community development and climate action, which kind of underpins the holistic ethos of the organisation. So next slide, please, Mark. So when I talk about holistic impact, talking about kind of the 4 pillars that underpin both PV Nature and PV Climate on the carbon side as well, that's participatory design, biodiversity impact, social impact, and climate impact as well. On the sorry, I'm struggling to say that word today, participatory design, we're looking at upholding the rights of all users of the area, Indigenous peoples and those with access to the biodiversity resources in the local area, and really trying to drill home the importance of community ownership. So not just kind of engagement in the design phase, but including communities and Indigenous groups in all aspects of the project. And importantly, making sure that any new markets are accessible for the types of projects we work with. So kind of affordable, and they also make sense for community-based organisations. On the biodiversity impact pillar, so for PV Nature, this is the bit that is really quantified using the approved methodology. And this helps with kind of the real additional ecosystem service benefits, and also to have some comparability between different ecosystems. So the methodology we've gone with, it has some degree of flexibility to adapt to different ecosystems, but still kind of comparability and a way of kind of showcasing either uplift within a restoration project or maintaining a baseline within the conservation projects. And then on the social impact side, projects have to demonstrate that they have positive livelihood and socioeconomic impacts and that the benefits are shared equitably, which I'll also touch on more later on. And lastly, climate impact. So taking into account kind of the dual crises of biodiversity loss and climate change, the biodiversity projects have a recognition and maintenance of carbon pools if it is within an ecosystem that has kind of strong carbon pools. And if not, we've got sort of recognition of increased biodiversity resilience and how that then contributes to improve resilience to climate change at both a local level and a species level and community level as well. These are all kind of showcased in the project design through the theory of change, which has to be realistic and long-term. So typically the projects we work with are about 20 years or so in length, and we're really looking at kind of long-term benefits, both for biodiversity, social, and the climate. Next slide, please, Mark. So taking these into account, one PVBC, so Plan Vivo Biodiversity Certificate, represents evidence-based outcomes for biodiversity, climate, and communities that are both additional, that Erika touched on in her presentation, and verifiable as well. So these are kind of some core values for biodiversity certificates that we've really built on, not just from our experience within the voluntary carbon market, but also from our experience working with community projects around the world. And from that, we've kind of got some key aspects of what we think biodiversity certificates need to be and what they need to include. So firstly, they need to be high integrity. So looking at like real outcomes, quantifiable outcomes on biodiversity uplift and conservation, and based on credible claims. They also need to be issued through a credible standard or accrediting program and onto a registry. That's really important for having transparency and also being able to trace where the claims come from and trace the certificates. And lastly, there needs to be third-party verification. So a third party who can go and audit the kind of uplift or conservation of claims across the project. The way we're applying this in PV Nature is by using digital monitoring methods. So video transects or camera traps or audio moths that mean that there's an audit trail of the data that's been digitally collected. And as been mentioned a little bit earlier on, also important that they're very much aiming these as a contribution towards nature positive and not as an offset market due to kind of the ethical and ecological considerations around that. Next slide, please, Mark. So how do we uphold the participatory and inclusive processes within Plan Vivo projects? There's kind of a few requirements throughout the standards that kind of link to this. But really, it's a recognition that there's an intrinsic link, really, between coastal ecosystems, biodiversity, fisheries, and livelihoods, within all ecosystems, but particularly so with coastal fishery communities. And that needs to be kind of respected and integrated into all aspects of the project. So we've got stakeholder consultations and engagement, which will happen in kind of the early stages and throughout the whole of the project design. These means engaging with any stakeholder that has kind of any vested interest or kind of access to the biodiversity in the area. And then taking it a step further, I mentioned earlier about participatory governance and the inclusion of the participants in the decision making. So making sure that there is a kind of clear governance structure that means that local communities and participants can have a say in what they want to be done with the local area, and also involvement of the communities in biodiversity as well. All projects need to uphold the principles of FPIC, so free, prayer, and informed consent, and make sure that there's fair project agreements in the local language that really lays out kind of the expectations of the participants and of the coordinators as well. And grievance mechanisms that mean that if there are problems, then people know how to raise the grievances, and there's a process in place that means these are implemented as well. And lastly, on the social and environmental safeguards, it's a kind of a separate screening process that looks at kind of additional risks, maybe around increased conflict over land tenure or decreased access to resources, if we're looking at maybe seasonal closures. And on the environmental side, making sure there's not any displacement of any other ecologically functioning ecosystems, for example, like planting mangroves on seagrass, that would all be picked up on in the environmental safeguards. So next slide. And also important within the PV Nature projects is the benefit sharing mechanism. So we, as an organization, really see either carbon finance or biodiversity finance as a driver to long-term sustainable benefits and long-term sustainable impacts on the ground. And a key part of that is making sure that the benefits are actually equitably shared. And 60% at least goes back to the communities on the ground. That it really depends on the kind of the situation, the community groups, and the countries of choice, that they'll decide on what the benefit sharing mechanism looks like for them. But typically we see it goes towards kind of creation of livelihoods, local jobs, sort of improved infrastructure, and various things like that. Next one, please, Mark. I thought it would be helpful as well to give an example of the projects that are currently in the pipeline. And I think we've got 9 or so pipeline projects, which means the PIN's been submitted and approved to us. And for the sake of this call, I've just put on the marine ones so I can showcase kind of the diversity of the habitats that we've got some interest with. So there's a mixture of kind of coral, seagrass, merle, and one mangrove project, which is exciting, and also a seascape level project in the UK, which has been very good learning for us, both in seeing how the benefit sharing mechanism and the participatory approaches can be applied in the global north, and also how the methodology can be applied kind of at a seascape level. So next slide, please. I'm going to hone in on a particular project and spotlight with a little bit more detail on the Vanga seagrass project in Kenya. So I see actually Amelia, who's been a key player in getting this project off the ground, is in the call. So great to see you. And this project is developed by ACES, the Association for Coastal Ecosystem Services, and the community groups in the Vanga Bay and technical partners from the Kenya Marine Research and Fisheries Institute. So this is a really interesting project as well, because it's building on the successes of a mangrove project in the area that's certified under PV Climate, that's generating carbon credits, and then looking to see how biodiversity finance can finance the seagrass work, the seagrass conservation. So it's 200 hectares or so of intertidal and subtidal seagrass, which covers 14% of Kenya's seagrass ecosystems. And through the project interventions, the coordinators are looking to combat unsustainable seam net fishing and other destructive fishing practices, which over time will enable the habitat to recover and the fisheries to recover, and then you'll get the livelihood impacts from that as well. So next slide, please, Mark. Lastly, to finish with, I guess, some ongoing considerations and challenges. I think through the development of the standard and working with the pilot projects, we've managed to achieve a lot, but there's of course still ongoing things that we're struggling with or sort of talking about. And one of them that I think Alessandro touched on is understanding the market and the market demand. So really engaging with buyers to understand what the business case is and what the demand is and what the claims that buyers want to make are around the purchase of biodiversity certificates. On the technical side, it's been more complicated with the marine monitoring within the marine projects to find an approach that's both digital and kind of you can collect it digitally, but also has good enough quality, taking into account like turbidity and water quality to be able to identify species. So we've got ongoing conversations and a working group being set up with the marine pilot projects to put forward some suggestions to change the methodology for the marine projects. And then lastly, on the financial side, even though we're really tapping into a new market and trying to unlock more funding for these projects, we're still seeing the case that the startup costs are very expensive, as they are with voluntary carbon projects as well. The equipment to be purchased is often quite expensive and often not really available in some countries. And the development, the certification fees, the community consultations, that all costs a lot of money and takes a fair amount of time. So really, we still do need the kind of the upfront funding, either through grants or philanthropy or early investments, to be able to really realize the potential of the biodiversity markets as well. Next slide, please, Mark. That is actually me for today. Thank you for listening. I've got my email there and also just the generic contact emails if anyone wants to reach out.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. We are down to our last 2 or 3 minutes. So I saw that questions asked in the chat have been answered. We did have a couple submitted ahead of this presentation. And so just real quick for our last couple of minutes. Firstly, anybody who is watching, who is interested in further subjects for these webinars, please do drop suggestions in the chat. And one question submitted by email, which it would be good to get a bit of clarification around, is the different perspectives on linking both biodiversity credits and carbon credits within the same project. And we saw Vanga use 2 different ecosystems, and so that it's not really overlapping. But what's the current market perspective on that. I know this is quite a mixed issue. So to any of our presenters, please feel free to jump in. Thank you.
I can go in with an answer there, and then I'll let Alessandro and Erika answer as well if they have anything. So we have been seeing a little bit across projects, the idea of stacking. But to be honest, most of the pipeline projects or the pilot projects are more interested at this point in standalone biodiversity certificates and standalone carbon certificates, really because of the complexities of managing two projects within one area. Having said that, there is potential to kind of double the amount of income based off of like the dual markets together and stacking them together. But for us, we've got some quite clear requirements on separating out the activities that are related to each of the different sources of finance. It's more tricky to separate out the outcomes. There will be some overlap between the kind of the biodiversity uplift from the carbon project and vice versa. But at this point, focusing more on, the additionality of project interventions. So more income from a different certification would lead to more activities, which should lead to greater uplift overall.
Thank you very much.
And
Erika and Alessandro.
yeah, I'm happy to quickly jump in. So we are looking at a couple of stacking opportunities across the same project. So one terrestrial and one which is seagrass restoration. And as I mentioned, that's predominantly to enable a more viable project in those circumstances, particularly for the seagrass, actually. So I think generally with blue carbon opportunities, additional revenue streams are important. So some of what we're navigating through, as I touched on, are the concepts of additionality and ensuring there's no double counting. So I guess we've been working through with Vera, for example, how from an additionality perspective, how you actually talk to what the biodiversity or nature credit revenue would bring explicitly to the project and enable. So that's sort of the key challenge to navigate. And perhaps just one thing to point out, and I might have mentioned this earlier, but at least Plan Vivo and Vera, not to speak on your behalf, Evie, but are very strict about if you do want to do stacking, you have to do it with their commensurate carbon and nature or carbon and biodiversity opportunities. So you can only use Vera with Vera, you can only use Plan Vivo with Plan Vivo.
Cool, thank you so much.
Just
Alessandro.
a word from me, Mark. I won't take more than 30 seconds, but I do think them as a little bit different in terms of, as mentioned, maybe nature is going more toward the direction of project finance, infrastructure, and all of that. From a finance point of view, more than a commodity. We don't want really to commoditize nature in that sense. But at the same time, there's a good there's a good idea there to use kind of the working markets of carbon to start going the nature ones, right? If we can start with those stacking opportunity to get the market of biodiversity going, that will help a lot to reach the scale sooner and use already something that is being proved and is working, and not just reinvent the wheel overall. So I think there's that dichotomy there. I still think that using the carbon market and piggybacking on what the infrastructure of the carbon market would help a lot biodiversity markets to develop even on its own in 2, 3, 5 years, 10 years from now.
Cool, thank you so much. I would love to hear more from everyone, but unfortunately we are out of time. So just to extend a huge thank you for our presenters and participants and my co-host for everything you've all done. Please watch your inboxes for invitations to future webinars. If you are not a GMA member, do check out our website and consider whether joining might be a good fit for your organisation or your work. And future topics will be covering blue carbon markets, how to estimate costs of carbon projects or mangrove restoration projects in advance, and really diving into some of the different finance mechanisms available. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.